Occupation, released this year. These are my thoughts after watching Occupation. I've watched it twice this week. I found it on X, and it's a political film that addresses really the impact of Israel, of the Jews, the Zionists, throughout history up until the current time, and it's an impactful film. Let's put it this way. Regardless of where you might stand politically, it's probably better if you open the door to this film with a sort of an open opinion. I opened it, of course, with a sort of slightly prejudiced view with regard to my political feelings towards what's going on currently in Gaza, and my knowledge that I picked up from the inquiries that I've made over the last year or so. The film opens with early scenes of human carnage, really, on the Gaza Strip, where we see people frantically trying to rescue people, children, you name it, from rubble as a result of the bombing raids by the Israeli Air Force over the last year. And some of the scenes are harrowing, to say the least, emotionally charged. We then sort of get added to this narrated commentary from a number of Americans who I think are regarded by the director as probably your average Commonwealth Garden American, who hasn't got very strong political views, but nevertheless is straightforward and is able to express themselves, and where they see a situation that requires an opinion, they'll give it to you. And generally the opinion that we hear from these is that they perceive the current Israeli government as nothing short of being, how can I put it, sinister, murderous, without feeling, and determined to carry out what we later hear is a plan. This is an abbreviated view of mine as to what I saw. As I say, we then sort of get in touch to an extent with the history, which goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, and we hear about the emergence of Jews all over the world and their innate ability to be able to acquire considerable amounts of wealth wherever they are. They have a creativity and an instinct for good business, and business that may be less good, maybe somewhat sinister, maybe somewhat corrupt, but they certainly have an ability to rise to the top when it comes to acquiring wealth. And this then leads slowly into a critique about how in a variety of countries they tend to be very much into a tribal way of life. They they are very protective towards their own, and they are enslaved by a religious prophecy that suggests that they are God's chosen people, and that they will ultimately become the sole power over the earth, and the rest will do what they're told to do by the Jewish fraternity. It's not told in a sort of arrogant way. It's almost as a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, really, that this is going to be inevitable. We then get a picture of a brief snapshot of the current situation, and as has been mentioned before, the question is asked with regard to the current slaughter stroke genocide in Gaza is why children, why babies? And we hear from some Jewish members who clearly say that the babies of today will become fighters and enemies as they move into adulthood, and therefore to eliminate them now means that they don't have to face the problem later on. This sort of perception of the fact that they view potentially all other groups, but particularly Muslim groups, as enemies, irrespective of who they might be, but clearly because they are a member of that group, and they see each group as rigidly defined as a group that either hate you or don't hate you. We then capture some of the history that becomes more and more alarming as we view it. We hear about how the Jewish groups became more and more integrated into the countries where they resided, and began to extract the benefits from that country to an extent that they would become more and more empowered, and others would become less and less empowered. And we hear about the impact that Jews had in Germany in the 30s, which led to Germany being on its knees economically in the early 30s, before the arrival of Hitler, and more of him a bit later. We also touch on the impact that Israel and Zionists in particular have had on their relationship with the United States, and it becomes more and more evident that they see the United States with its powerful military, powerful economy, and huge assets as one that they must keep by their side as their prime sort of friend on the planet, but in a way where they are in charge and the Americans are following their directions. We see how this equates with regard to the political machinery in Washington, where both political parties, both Democrats and Republicans, are almost 100% in support of the Israel's right to self-determination. And these members of the Senate and the House of Representatives have sworn allegiance to Israel at the time that they took office and are all in receipt of huge financial payments by AIPAC, which is a Jewish lobby group, and that effectively, when it comes to any votes, they are the Israelis are confident that they hold all the cards, and that the Senate and House will vote against any sanctions that might be put forward against Israel, and vote with them to support them both politically, monetarily and economically. And it becomes clear that the relationship appears to be that Israel are very much the parent and the United States is very much the child who does as they are told. We then move on to what's described as the second biggest event in the history of our world as we see it. The first being the Holocaust in World War II, the second being the events of September 11, the 9th of September, the 11th of September 2001, the day that the World Trade Center was hit by aircraft. There's some analysis into the explanation presented by the authorities, and this explanation is really torn to shreds, and an alternative look at why it happened is presented, which suggests very strongly that there are links to Israel and the United States working together to enable a villain to be created, a fictional villain who is of course an Arab from the Middle East, and initially was seen as potentially Saddam Hussein. And this is after Netanyahu has made a statement to the United Nations before 9/11, suggesting that the most dangerous threat to the planet's existence is the rise of militias, various factions within the Middle East who are intent on destroying all Christians and all whites. And so this, of course, generates a fear of conflicts, so that when it's suggested that a man in a cave was possibly responsible for the attack on the United States on 9/11 at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, it's almost a fait accompli that Congress will then signal to go to war on that basis. We hear, however, from a number of parties who suggest that dead cert of an explanation is far from possibly what really happened and who was responsible. And the argument is put forward in some detail about the connection between a false flag, a very, very expensive false flag in terms of lives lost, whereby Israel bought the Twin Towers a few weeks before the planes hit the towers, had a huge insurance premium on that. And then we hear the absolutely crazy explanation by why certain influential members who bought the towers for work were apparently not at work on the morning that the planes hit the towers. There's a fantastical bit of narrative from one of the richest Jews on the planet, Larry can't remember his second name, who then announces that the reason that he wasn't at work that morning was because of some skin condition, and his wife insisted that he not go to the office but go to his doctor instead. And it really is laughable to consider this as factually correct and an honest answer. We then drawn parallels between the rise of Zionism, the rise of influence by the Jewish business community vis-a-vis with the beginning of the rise of National Socialisms in Germany in the 30s, and there are certain quite clear common denominators. We hear that after Hitler was brought to power in a fair democratic election, he then became faced with the fact that the Jewish community, the Jewish business community, were in fact bleeding the country dry, were involved in their types of businesses that were less than satisfying to the population, involved in prostitution, homosexuality, and really garish activities. You only need to take a look at the movie Cabaret to see what was going on in Germany prior to and subsequent to the arrival of Adolf Hitler in charge of Germany. And we then have to consider what I think one of the most dramatic points made for me, and that it was the suggestion that the Holocaust, as we've been taught, as we've been led to believe, may in fact not be an accurate interpretation of what happened, based on the fact that a number of the so-called death camps, there appeared to be a lack of crematoria evidence to suggest that 5 million Jews were slaughtered. Now, we also earlier had to consider the fact that the Israelis actually created Hamas and enabled Hamas to start the so-called war on October the 6th, 2023. But it becomes clear from what we hear that they used the fact that a number of Hamas, who were probably paid off and have now since disappeared and living a life somewhere on the rich proceeds, actually engaged in the attack on inside the Israeli border, and were apparently did not meet with any resistance, and questions are being asked of why could they walk in so easily, and we then sort of have to, bearing in mind that evidence suggesting that that was a false flag, maybe the whole historical painting that we describe as the Holocaust in World War II may well also have been a false flag. Now, this is where I became rather shaky. Could I actually be looking at something that says that this did not exist? What I am prepared to accept and possibly did happen was that a number of Jews were put into prisons in the period of the Second World War because the National Socialist Party would not have wanted them to roam freely and to basically act as sort of terrorist cells for NATO, not for NATO, but for the Allies. And so there may well have been quite a large number of them who were kept in prison-like conditions at the camps that we mentioned. And yes, maybe some of the footage that we found towards the end of the war was possibly genuine, with people being left as the German guards fled, being left for periods of time without sufficient food and would have been malnourished. That is clearly a possible explanation. But as for the mountains of corpses that hadn't yet found the ovens, that may well have been a fabrication of some description. So we were left really with a suggestion that the globalists, who are largely in part a combination of the rich around the world and the Zionists, what are they going to do next, or what in fact we are going to do to wrestle away their control of the planet. And it was a mind-blowing film, really, which would challenge lots of assumptions about what's truth and what isn't truth. But I guess after the COVID pandemic and the lies that were told about the impact of the pandemic on the population of the world, it's wise that one shouldn't really just think that the movie was an act of fiction, or just a movie that could be labelled as anti-Semitic. A very important fact was made about some Semites, and that is that in the state of Israel, you can't test for your DNA, and the definition of Semites are people that were born in the land of Palestine. And when I think one person who came forward tested his own DNA, who was a Jew that came from Europe, the percentage in his DNA which would justify him being called a Semite and therefore a 95% Jew was well below that. And so when they start shouting about the language being anti-Semitic, the problem is that not many of the people who are being described as anti-Semitic, not many of the Jewish people who are being described as anti-Semitic, I'm sorry, I've got that right, not many of the people who are labelled as Semites are Semites. So if they're not Semites, your comment towards them cannot be anti-Semitic. That's what I wanted to make. So this slogan of anti-Semitism is really not worth the paper it's written on with regard to 90% of so-called Jews, because they're not Semite. I think I made that clear eventually. So anyway, that's my initial thoughts. I probably have missed some sacred elements to this movie, a documentary movie, and I really suggest people should look at it and make their own mind up. Oh fuck. Why is this? Okay, before I go to sleep, from 2014, and I'm going to read a review by James Berardinelli first, before you get my thoughts. It starts off, memory. It's an integral element to our definition of who we are. In our lives, most of us forget far more than we remember, but our ability to recall events, faces and names forms the building blocks of our identity. It's no surprise, therefore, that movie thrillers enjoy playing with the concept of amnesia. The amnesia can be an ideal choice for a protagonist because his or her background is shrouded in mystery. Unfortunately, too many of these movies devolve into exploitation flicks, more concerned with cheap twists than the visceral suspense that can result from a serious consideration of the situation. Were it not for the participation of two A-list actors, Nicole Kidman and Colin Firth, Before I Go to Sleep would have been headed straight to the video. The inclusion of those two doesn't make the film any better, just less anonymous. The dubious premise requires that the viewer suspend disbelief, but that's not unreasonable. As a result of something that happened to her about 10 years ago, Christine, played by Kidman, awakens every morning with no recent memories. Although she's 40, she thinks she's in her early 20s, meaning that the last 16 plus years of her life have been wiped from her mind, or at least inaccessible. Her loving, long-suffering husband, Ben, played by Firth, does what he can to help her every morning with a wall of photographs that provide a summary of who he is, what they are to one another, etc. She also has a secret psychiatrist, played by Mark Strong. His name is Dr. Nash, who encourages her to keep a video diary. He calls her every morning to tell her where to find the camera. As Christine begins to recapture glimpses of her past, questions emerge. Who is the mysterious red-haired woman she was close to? Is her condition the result of a car accident or an attack? Is Dr. Nash as benevolent as he seems? And is Ben just a devoted husband or something else? For a while, Before I Go to Sleep keeps us involved, as writer-director Rowan Joffe, adapting from S.J. Watson's novel, spins his web. As with all films involving amnesiac protagonists, it's fun trying to piece together the truth and differentiate fact from fiction. To its credit, Before I Go to Sleep doesn't go overboard with its plot contortions. Christine doesn't turn out to be an MI5 operative, and there are no quick fix medicines that return her history in a rush. But that doesn't mean the resolution is satisfying. The film's last third is a case study in how not to make a movie like this. Character motivations make a little sense. Narrative logic is thrown out of the window, and plot holes are plugged with throwaway lines that, when considered, often seem arbitrary. Kidman and Firth are on hand to collect paychecks. Both actors have won Academy Awards, but their performances here are closer to mail it in than Oscar caliber. Kidman is more disappointing than Firth because her interpretation of Christine is flat and uninvolving. Firth remains on the periphery for most of the film, although he does a reasonable job highlighting the two potential sides of Ben's character, dutiful husband or manipulator. One could argue that the nature of the story contributes to the lack of emotional connection between the leads, but it's off-putting. When passion finally emerges in the last reel, it feels contrived and unnatural. Joffe wisely doesn't ape Christopher Nolan's approach in the brilliantly executed Memento. To do so would have invited unfavourable comparisons, but his sure-handed, albeit conventional approach to the material only goes far enough to make the setup compelling. Before I Go to Sleep is on solid ground when laying the framework and asking questions. It goes off the rails when it starts providing resolutions. There are twists aplenty, but not sufficient tension or should stay in suspense to cover up the fissures that widen as the movie progresses. Although the story is all about memory, the film itself is forgettable. There we have it. Early on, Strong, the doctor, contacts her and asks her to locate the camera, which has a video that she made previously the day before, explaining what's going on with her memory. Then we're in the car, him and her, and he makes a point of making it clear that what he is doing is unethical, in as much as he hasn't notified the husband. So this immediately sort of conjures up a sort of a red flag, really. What's he up to? So the plot has immediately put into play the fact that he might well be after cheap sex or whatever. I don't know, but yeah, we'll go with it. Dr. Nash tells her that she was found on an estate after a serious assault, that she'd been attacked repeatedly in the head, and Kidman's character responds by suggesting that she was a victim of a possible murder attempt, but the doctor doesn't comment on that. But it certainly raised her level of anxiety for sure. And so I'm going to try and do the whodunit on here, I guess. Get sucked into it, and just reminding myself it's Ben and what's her name again? Christine. Okay. Whilst listening to this dialogue, it's interesting to consider this sort of concept. In fact, it's quite frightening. The idea that you can't move forward, that you can't retain anything, that you have done. It all becomes erased. And so what we haven't had is any memory recall of things that happened before the incident of assault, so far anyway. We're almost getting presented with a case of the fact that she has nothing, no recall. But I thought I was led to understand that it's just new information that she can't recall post assault. So like Memento, we're going down various sort of rabbit holes, and the doctor seems to be leading the trail. He takes Christine back to where she was found, beaten up, naked, with a sheet over her, and then we get led down through the dialogue with the inference that she may well have had a lover, she'd had sex which was consensual, and she was near the airport, and of course there were lots of hotels there, so either she had a lover or maybe she was casually involved in sort of prostitution, high class call girl, or whatever. I like these sort of movies. As the movie progresses, she starts to recall extremely limited amount of memory a friend, Claire, then she recalls a possibility of being pregnant. But these little snippets, of course, introduce sort of different problems, like trust in her husband Ben. With regard to the friend, he has photographs of the girl, but he said he didn't tell her about the Claire because she left for Canada after a considerable amount of time when she used to visit, and then repeatedly Christine couldn't remember her, so it was sort of like a closed door. But this provokes Christine's view that she can't trust her husband because her husband isn't telling her everything. There's a scene where it becomes evident that he's a bit of a short fuse at times. Well, the whole idea of living with somebody who is your wife, but they can't remember who you are, it also sort of brings to the fore the whole issue about Alzheimer's, which is a more permanent condition. And it's not just all about the person, the sufferer, it's those who love them and aren't getting anything back. It's 100% one way. I think this is one of the problems with relationships, really, either in reality or in thought, that one feels that a relationship is too far in one direction. That's why people stray, because they aren't getting their 50% or whatever. So it throws up the whole notion of about how much is enough to maintain a relationship that's strong. Slowly, little snippets start to be recalled. Having a child, she's told that he died. Then with the psychiatrist, she has a brief memory that he's covered in blood. She flees the car, and one sort of senses that she may well be unravelling, which is putting others into jeopardy, whether they be her husband, whether they be the doctor, whether they be another. The paradox here is that as Christine starts to gain some sort of memory, it unravels more of the reality of life, which is pretty sordid and sick. For example, her friend, who she then reunites with, and at one meeting it becomes evident that the pressure that her friend was experiencing trying to deal with Christine and the issues connecting with the husband had led to a brief fling between Claire the friend and Ben the husband. This then provokes a response of being cheated on, where previously she had no memory, she had no emotion connected with that alleged fact, but once it becomes evident, and a new emotion appears, and that's lack of trust. So it's a sort of paradox. You get healthy, but you feel worse because you know more. Does that make any sense? I don't know. As the movie moves into its final sort of phase, its final quarter, the mood of the movie changes from a sort of analysis as to Christine's circumstances and how to try and get a result with regard to her amnesia. It shifts more towards a sort of horror type flick, with the two males appearing to be in competition for Christine's attention and affection. And at that point I thought the film lost its believability.